Premetto subito che se dovessi portare un dono invece a Patrizia Sandretto de Gaudengo, visto che non posso procurarmi la corona d'Inghilterra, non saprei cosa portare di adeguato, perché quello che fa Patrizia nel mondo, ma grazie a Dio a Torino, col suo brillante consorte Agostino, è assolutamente straordinario. Sono onorato di portare i saluti del Presidente della Regione Roberto Cota, ma anche del Presidente del Parlamento regionale, l'onorevole Cattaneo, perché secondo me, come minimo, è giusto che una regione si inchini a un evento così e a degli ospiti così straordinari. Io stesso sono seduto vicino a personalità fantastiche. Devo dire, siccome sono un politico, bisognerebbe anche che la regione e tutti fossero conseguenti poi nelle scelte amministrative e deliberative, perché avere dei mecenati illuminati come la famiglia Sandretto de Gaudengo è una roba da New York, è una roba fantastica. Quindi ho da Mosca, grazie, è vero, me l'hai presentato già, io poi sono un sostenitore della coesistenza dei tempi di Sakharov. Dico all'amico di Mosca che gli feci dare la cittadinanza onoraria di Torino a Sakharov. Allora il Partito Comunista votò contro, ma oggi le cose sono cambiate. E quindi voglio dire, proprio mi inchino ammirato. Penso che sia dovere di ogni amministratore che abbia un briciolo di cervello, perché quella è già una cosa complicata, e vabbè, però insomma, inchinarsi di fronte a queste iniziative. Io ho portato un modesto omaggio per far vedere che il Piemonte è bello, cioè il Piemonte è bello di per sé, ma è più bello grazie alla cultura, all'intelligenza, alla creatività che tante delle persone che ho riunito stasera, ne vedo tanti che hanno lavorato alle Olimpiadi, ai 150 anni, a tanti eventi, e ti sono molto grato. Vado a sedermi perché prendo anche appunti, ma prima ti faccio l'omaggio. Grazie.
Davvero grazie, è bello vedervi in tanti, venite qui per questa serata in onore di Richard Armstrong e poi seguirà l'inaugurazione della mostra successivamente a questo incontro con Richard. E questa sera devo dire che Torino è una città davvero molto internazionale, molto cosmopolita, perché tantissimi sono gli ospiti che sono arrivati da tutto il mondo, e quando dico tutto il mondo posso proprio dire da New York, ma anche da Mosca e poi da tante altre capitali, Lussemburgo, insomma sono tantissime le città, ne troppe, quindi mi fermo lì, ma comunque davvero da tutto il mondo sono venute delle persone a Torino per questa serata, e quindi per me è davvero un momento di gioia e sono felice di poterla condividere con tanti amici, con tante persone che questa sera, seppur con tanta neve, hanno preso la macchina e sono venuti qui in fondazione. Grazie davvero. Sono poi anche emozionata, ovviamente, e anche onorata di avere qui in fondazione Richard Armstrong. Richard Armstrong ha bisogno di presentazioni, il direttore del Solomon Guggenheim Museum di New York, ma anche della fondazione Guggenheim. E io gli sono veramente grato per essere qui questa sera con noi e aver portato tanti solleciti, tante persone che hanno voluto condividere questa sera, e il mio grazie poi ovviamente va anche a tutte le autorità, a tutte le personalità della nostra città e della nostra regione. Il Guggenheim, io ho sempre guardato al Guggenheim, alla famiglia Guggenheim, come ad un esempio straordinario di collezionismo, di mecenatismo, per sostenere l'arte contemporanea. Peggy Guggenheim non posso non nominarla in una serata come questa, perché Peggy Guggenheim ha esercitato fin dall'inizio del mio collezionare su di me un fascino un po' speciale. Per me è una fonte davvero di continua ispirazione che si rinnova tutte le volte che vado a visitare il Museo Guggenheim a Venezia. E così come anche ovviamente lo stesso posso dire di provare tutte le volte che entro nella sede di New York del Guggenheim. E quindi questa sera sono davvero felice di avere qui Richard Armstrong. Io non lo conosco da tantissimo tempo, ci siamo conosciuti tempo fa, eravamo tutti e due parte di una giuria, della giuria del premio Ariane de Roche, e devo dire che è stato splendido conoscere, perché Richard è davvero, al di là del suo ruolo, una persona speciale, una persona incredibile. E quando un po' di tempo fa a New York, intanto così sono arrivati, ho appena finito di, cioè Philip Rylance, ho appena finito di parlare di voi, del vostro bel museo, di quanto è importante per me Peggy, quindi benvenuti anche voi. E come dicevo, un po' di tempo fa a New York, davanti a un porridge che abbiamo diviso con Richard, timidamente lo invitai a venire a Torino a presentare il Guggenheim. Lui senza esitare mi rispose quando. Ecco, quindi questa è la grandezza di un uomo impegnatissimo, ma che comunque ascolta tutti, parla con tutti, ha trovato il tempo appunto di condividere questa giornata con noi. Così come non posso dimenticare la visita 2 giorni prima dell'inaugurazione della mostra di Maurizio Cattelan al Guggenheim. Sapete, questa mostra che, possiamo dirlo, ha fatto un numero incredibile di visitatori, ha fatto 340.000 visitatori, 360.000, un numero incredibile. Credo che sia la seconda mostra più visitata al Guggenheim di New York. E devo dire che appunto quando Richard mi ha invitato a visitare la mostra precedentemente all'inaugurazione, e visitare il Guggenheim, lui ed io, e che ancora stava lavorando per installando le ultime opere in questo museo splendido con tutte le opere di Maurizio appese al soffitto, è stata veramente un'esperienza incredibile, quindi anche di questo devo ringraziare Richard Armstrong. Ma venendo ad oggi, questo incontro di questa sera apre un anno che per noi qui in Fondazione è particolarmente importante. Nel 2012 festeggiamo 20 anni dall'inizio della mia attività di collezionista e 10 anni dall'apertura di questa sede, quindi quest'anno è un anno significativo per noi. E quindi, dopo che Richard Armstrong ci avrà permesso di conoscere meglio quella che è il grande mondo Guggenheim, inaugureremo la mostra che si intitola Press Play, che è curata da Irene Calderoni, che è qui in sala lì schiacciata contro il muro, ma che ringrazio per la professionalità, per la serietà che ha lavorato per la realizzazione di questa mostra, che come vedrete è una mostra molto bella, una mostra speciale, è una mostra dedicata al rapporto che vi è fra l'arte contemporanea e l'informazione, e quindi una mostra che affronta delle questioni davvero di stringente attualità. Tutti noi ogni giorno siamo immersi in un flusso informativo continuo, immagini, parole che ci arrivano un po' da tutte le parti, dai giornali, dalla televisione, dall'internet, dai cellulari, e in questa condizione con così tante informazioni è sempre più difficile per noi a volte orientarci e poter capire ed incidere. E noi crediamo che l'arte possa offrirci proprio uno strumento, degli strumenti per invece interpretare, per capire, e quindi che ci insegna l'arte anche a guardare e a leggere meglio il nostro tempo. In questa mostra, che fra poco avrete modo di vedere, vi sono alcune opere della collezione, fra le altre potete andare assolutamente a vedere quella di Hans-Peter Feldman, che è un'opera dedicata all'11 settembre, quindi a un momento molto vicino alla storia americana, ma anche l'installazione di Alessandro Gagliardo in sala, che è stata in parte prodotta dalla Fondazione Sandretto Nere Goldengo, ma anche opere come l'opera di Pierre, che è un'opera che il Guggenheim c'è sempre stato, e quindi anche una volta grazie a Richard per questo prestito. Sempre con Press Play abbiamo pensato di lanciare un nuovo progetto, che vuole coinvolgere i giovani, che per noi sono così importanti, e far dialogare l'arte con la musica, con il cinema, attraverso una colonna sonora, che è stata proprio realizzata per la mostra. È la prima volta un esperimento, abbiamo appunto chiesto a diversi DJ, compositori, di scrivere una colonna sonora per la nostra mostra. E è stato un concorso. Questo concorso intitolato Soundart è stato vinto, questa prima edizione è stata vinta dalla DJ Chiara Luzzani, che sono qui in sala, in Milano. Magari se ti fai vedere così ci complimentiamo con te. Questa sera, all'ingresso del bookshop, potrete sentire in anteprima la colonna sonora vincitrice, che poi durante la mostra i visitatori potranno ascoltare con dei lettori MP3. E anche quindi un'occasione per ringraziare anche Wired, la stampa, che sono tutti stati i nostri sponsor in questi eventi, che avrò senz'altro dimenticato qualcuno, ma spero di no. Ancora un'altra notizia, che da 2 settimane è iniziata iniziata la 6ª edizione delle residenze per giovani curatori. Sono arrivati pochi giorni fa i 3 curatori, anche loro sono in sala, Benoît Antil, Michel Fiedler e Andrei Parshikov, sono qui appunto giunti, sono 3 ragazzi, ogni anno una giuria selezionata sceglie 3 giovani curatori dalle migliori scuole curatoriali del mondo. Questi 3 curatori vengono a Torino, poi viaggiano per 4 mesi e girano l'Italia. Lo scopo di questo progetto è di permettere a dei curatori stranieri di conoscere i nostri artisti italiani, di visitare i loro studi. Infatti in questi loro mesi visitano circa 200, più di 200 artisti, per poi tornare a Torino e realizzare una mostra appunto con gli artisti italiani che hanno conosciuto nel loro viaggio. Questo progetto per noi è molto importante perché è un modo per sostenere la nostra arte italiana e al tempo stesso per permettere ai giovani curatori di crescere, di fare esperienza e di curare anche una loro mostra, un loro catalogo. Questo progetto, che è un progetto che è nato fin dall'inizio con la collaborazione della compagnia San Paolo, da pochissimi tempi vede coinvolto, e qui abbiamo in sala, quindi lo ringrazio, coinvolto la Fondazione Victoria di Art in Contemporary di Mosca, che qui è rappresentata dal suo presidente, Leonid Michelson, che è ovviamente il presidente di questa fondazione, ma soprattutto è un grande amico. Ed io sono davvero onorata perché oggi, insieme alla sua direttrice, che è qua seduta vicino, Teresa Marica, che è italiana ma vive ormai da molti anni a Mosca, insieme hanno preso l'aereo, sono arrivati sotto la neve, si fermano pochissime ore e ripartono questa sera, ma hanno voluto essere qui con noi. Questo credo che sia un gesto bellissimo, sono dei veri amici e io ringrazio tantissimo, vi ringrazio profondamente per questo gesto così bello, per aiutare i nostri progetti. Abbiamo già collaborato insieme sulla mostra Modernico lo scorso 2 anni fa ormai sulla Russia, e siamo contenti di nuovo insieme di lavorare su un nuovo progetto. Grazie davvero Leonid per essere qua con noi. Sono un po' dilungata, quindi adesso credo che sia ora che io stia zitta. Desidero però augurarvi ancora a tutti una bella serata. Ascolteremo adesso questa bellissima presentazione. Io ho avuto modo di vederla prima, splendida, avrete veramente il modo di entrare nel mondo Google, che è un mondo affascinante e che siamo davvero ancora una volta felici e onorati di aver Richard qua con noi. Grazie a tutti, buona serata.
Thank you, Patrizia. I see that your enthusiasm is very infectious, as it should be. I'm very happy to be visiting Turin for the first time, and I think I'll be coming back because I understand that it's a city for artists and people who understand beauty. We're looking at a city that's not always so hospitable to beauty behind me. This is New York recently. You probably didn't realize the Guggenheim was on the beach, but it's not really the beach that we can go swimming in. This is the reservoir for the drinking water and shower water. The little band of trees connects to Central Park, and on the right side you see the edge of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is our sister institution. Fifth Avenue, which is the street that helps define Manhattan, runs in front of the museum. And then you see this very unusual shape, which people in 1959 referred to as a washing machine or a flying saucer, which is the Frank Lloyd Wright design for the Guggenheim Museum. And behind a building that was put up in 1992, designed by Gwathmey Siegel, which allows the museum to have square galleries, level floors, and offices. So 2 buildings put together, one in 1959, one in 1992. This is Solomon R. Guggenheim, relatively late in his life. He's born in 1861 in Philadelphia. His family came from a region near Zurich. They were Jewish, and they'd been victimized by the 30 Years' War in Germany. So they left Germany, moved to Switzerland, lived there for more than 200 years, and in 1848 came to Philadelphia, where they were peddlers of stove polish, so a very modest beginning with the idea that They would work hard. There were 7 sons in this family, and they, through their father, became one of the wealthiest families in America from the period 1880 to about 1925. Mr. Guggenheim Sr. had made a very important investment in the 1870s. With 2 Quaker friends from Philadelphia, he bought a silver mine in Colorado. Although the mine was underwater, we use that expression today about mortgages, but in the first use it was about the mine being underwater. He went to Colorado, took all of his money, pumped the water out of the mine, and 3 months later they found the biggest amount of silver in the world in this mine. And over the next 30 years the family controlled silver, copper, lead, and many other materials, not only in North and South America, but also in Asia. Eventually, this is the company that became American Smelting and Refining Corporation, ASARCO, and it was comparable to Standard Oil, the Rockefeller's foundation, or the Rockefeller's source of income. And these 2 families, in many ways, were the most powerful of the American families connected to natural resources. So Mr. Guggenheim has a typical bourgeois life. He has a very nice wife. They begin collecting not very interesting Barbizon paintings, because that's what Americans do, especially nouveau riche Americans. And suddenly, when he's 61, he meets this person. And she didn't look quite like this when he met her. This is later in her life. This is someone called Baroness Hildegard Anna Augusta Elizabeth von Ehrenweissen, who became known as Hilla von Rebay, finally Hilla Rebay. She was herself an artist of, I would say, limited talent as a painter, but very dedicated. She was a student at the Bauhaus. She moved to America in 1926. In 1928, Mrs. Guggenheim invited her to make a portrait of her husband. By 1929, Miss Rebay and Mr. Guggenheim were very friendly, and she began taking him and the wife to Europe, and they began meeting avant-garde artists, particularly Delaunay, Leger, Moholy-Nagy, and most importantly, Kandinsky. So in the next 10 years after 1929, Mr. Guggenheim, through Miss Rebay, purchased over 150 paintings by Kandinsky, who was not as famous in those days as he is today. But her deep connection to the Bauhaus aesthetic is the idea that she mixes with theosophy and other sort of spiritualist ideas to claim that behavior can be changed by looking at art. And that's the origins of the Salmar Guggenheim Foundation. All during the 1930s, Mr. Guggenheim had a suite of rooms at the Plaza Hotel in New York, also on Fifth Avenue. Many of you know the Plaza Hotel. And he invited people to come to his apartment and see pictures. These aren't such great pictures, but not everything that they bought was perfect. In fact, Miss Rebay had another friend who was not a great artist, and Mr. Guggenheim bought more than 150 paintings by this artist today. But this was the beginning of America looking at abstraction in a different way. Patrizia, well, she'll be shy when I say this, but all the powerful things that happened in New York at that period were the responsibility of certain women who were in leadership. Mrs. Rockefeller, with her friends, began the Museum of Modern Art. Ms. Rebay, with support from the Guggenheim Foundation, began this museum. And Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, where I used to work with Juliana Force, began a museum for American art. The Metropolitan was more for the Museum of Men, but these 3 institutions really forced the city to become much more modern and, in fact, considerably more interesting. So for 7 or 8 years, people are invited to see these paintings in the plaza. In 1937, a foundation is formed. And in 1939, this car showroom on East 54th Street in New York, which was converted from an automobile showroom to a museum, opens, but it's called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which is a misinterpretation from German to English. There is really no such thing as non-objective painting, but that's what it was called. And it made a series of shows, principally about Bauhaus and Kandinsky. You can see that in the window they're talking about the Kandinsky Memorial Exhibition. I find it interesting because there's a neon sign that says museum outside the building. It's an interesting idea to attract people to this very peculiar space. You come in, you see these very large paintings with the biggest frames in the world, and they're hung very low. You're invited to lie down or sit down on these very big benches. There are fluorescent lights, which is quite radical at that moment, and not always flattering to paintings. And more interestingly, they're piping in music. So this is a Gesamtkunstwerk, where people are meant to dream in the company of the art, including the use of incense. So frequently you go into space and it's a very strange, hyper-spiritual experience in the company of paintings that may or may not be persuasive, hanging on velvet walls and lighted in this unusual way. Obviously this couldn't be a museum for the long term. So in 1943, Hilla Rebay writes to Frank Lloyd Wright and asks him to build a temple of art for the collection. And for many years, all during the 1940s, Frank Lloyd Wright, with the great commissioner of parks in New York called Robert Moses, is looking for sites for a possible museum. But Wright is obsessed with automobiles and wants the public to drive to the museum. So they're always looking at these places that are outside the center of the city, principally on the west side, principally up in this neighborhood called Morningside Heights. The family becomes less and less interested in the concept of a faraway museum. This property on Fifth Avenue between 88 and 89th Street becomes available, this apartment building. They, in 1952, they asked the Miss Rebay to retire. They connect to a different director who was working for the Museum of Modern Art called James Johnson Sweeney. Old Mr. Guggenheim died. A new generation in the family took over, and eventually, with the plans that Frank Lloyd Wright made for Miss Rebay, here's Wright, Mr. Guggenheim, and Miss Rebay. Construction was begun in this property between 88 and 89th Street. And you can see from the model, this is unlike any other museum ever imagined. In 1935, Frank Lloyd Wright had been commissioned to build a car collection outside of Baltimore. So he studied Bauhaus parking garages as an inspiration. And this building was never realized, but he made a very beautiful plan for a building that would have a planetarium in the middle and ramps around the outer edge for someone's car collection. I think that this idea is the one that sustains him over 15 years, thinking about the Guggenheim Museum eventually. In that building, that apartment building, James Johnson Sweeney introduces sculpture. He buys 11 Brancuzis in the first years of working at the museum. Miss Rebay, on the other side, felt that sculpture was not art. That's why the museum was called non-objective painting only. And it's Sweeney who really makes the museum come alive. Here's the site, 89th Street. You see the apartment building at the bottom. And then, beginning in 1954, the entire property is torn down, and Frank Lloyd Wright's 16th version of the building, he worked on this for 15 years, was finally begun to be realized. This very peculiar circular form that was built in a technology not really capable of this application. It's really meant for swimming pools. This is concrete gunite sprayed through a hose, and a very unusual application. We can see that the building quickly takes this form in the period 1956 until 1959. Here I'm showing you a very late drawing by Wright, and you can see the tower that I mentioned earlier, which he envisioned from that moment to be housing for artists. Fortunately, the museum couldn't afford to build that building, because the last thing the museum needs are artists living in the building. But it's an interesting idea, and then in 1992 it was realized in a different fashion. You also see in this drawing the idea that cars will drive through the museum, because this is a demonstration of Wright's very close connection to automobile culture, which I think is probably germane to Turin in particular. And for the first year, the museum actually allowed people to drive in. So this is how it looked in October 1959. You can see very unlike anything around it, not obeying the grid of the city, not responding in any way to these sort of Beaux-Arts townhouses nearby, which unfortunately are now gone. But in any case, a very powerful building which attracted 6,218 visitors its first day in 1959, because I think the public understood it was unlike anything they've ever seen before. Notice here, this entryway with the very bright light is the car entry. So you're allowed still at the beginning to drive the car into the museum. That's the first day. In this moment, people are still dressing up to visit museums. That changed. And here's how it looked on the opening day. So we say that this is the first democratic museum, because previously, if you're going to an art museum, really the model is a royal palace, which is a good model, but it's not the model of the people typically. Here's a museum that instead presents itself as a social experiment where all the visitors are treated equally, not always comfortably because it's difficult to either walk up or walk down, but nevertheless, all the visitors are seen as of equal value. Mr. Sweeney left. The gentleman in the middle, Tom Messer, becomes the director in 1961. Here seen in the company of his favorite artist, Jean Dubuffet, the French painter, and a friend of theirs who's in a Dubuffet outfit. And the museum for the next 27 years, 1961 until 1988, is very closely connected to avant-garde developments in Europe, and in some ways is the counterbalance to the Museum of Modern Art, which was so exclusively Francophiliac. So if you want to see art from outside of the French school, the only place that's regularly available in North America to see that would have been the Guggenheim. And Mr. Messer is himself from Slovakia, and the moment comes when the museum is looking at Czech artists and Hungarian artists of this region, which were not being seen at the Museum of Modern Art. So you can imagine there are two real, very lively places for information for an American audience, either Museum of Modern Art or the Guggenheim Museum. In these same days, the Whitney Museum becomes more and more provincial and reverts back to almost an exclusive taste for figurative painting, and is unable to really come to grips with what happens in the 1950s until the early 1960s. I can say that because I worked at that museum for 11 years also. She also had very, let's say, active taste in collecting Italian art, post-war Italian art, and after moving back to Venice, and moving to Venice in the late 1940s after the war, changes her aesthetic to become broader and more avant-garde even than previously. So today, you know this as the Great Peggy Guggenheim Collection, with superb examples going back to the early years of the 20th century, in an unusual environment. And from that very successful marriage of a milieu in Europe with New York comes Bilbao. So beginning in the late 1980s, the Basque Country comes to New York asking, could we build a building with them in Bilbao, which you know as at that moment a relatively battered and rundown steel center actually in the Basque Country, but with a very prescient leadership among its politicians, realizing that the future of the city would not be so much in heavy metals, but rather in culture. So they make a very big investment. Tom Krenz and the committee choose Frank Gehry, the great California architect, to make this building, which has in many ways changed the city completely. I went there because I lived previously in Pittsburgh. I went to see the foundations of the building in 1993 when it was first being built, and I went back to the mayor of Pittsburgh and said, don't worry, it'll never be built, and if it's built, no one will ever go there. And I was so wrong. But in Pittsburgh, we were building the Andy Warhol Museum, but we didn't have the vision to make a new building. We took an old building and tried to make something from that. Today, the Andy Warhol Museum, probably the most important artist after Picasso in the 20th century, attracts 97,000 visitors. This museum in Bilbao attracts 1 million visitors annually. This shows you also the power of very important architecture in attracting an unlikely audience. So you know the Jeff Koons puppy in front of the museum, which is a great symbol of its ability to be both popular and avant-garde. The building, as it's seen when you enter from the airport, as you know, it's located on this very deep tidal river. Previously, this was really a Superfund site. There were toxic metals on this site, so they had to be extracted, taken away. And this forms a linchpin now for Bilbao, which is in fact a 19-mile long city up and down this river through a very deep valley. And now the museum has allowed for regeneration of the city all the way to the Bay of Biscay, to the medieval and the 19th century city here to the left. And another view of it at night. The program is improving. We have many great exhibitions that come from New York that we also jointly organize. It's a place that allows for very good exhibitions not seen in this part of Europe to come to a large audience. If you come this summer, you'll see the David Hockney show, which opened at the Royal Academy last week or 2 weeks ago in the summertime, along with other examples from the collection. But if you read popular press or think about the questions of being in a city, which is the questions that we all have, since now more than 50% of the world lives in cities, we ask, what's the role of culture in helping define the city in a different way, post-industrial way, using cultural tourism as a catalyst for change that not only benefits hoteliers and restaurateurs, but also changes the citizens' vision of what life can be, particularly in a place like this, which I can say to you was previously relatively introverted, perhaps not so exciting, and suffered from very severe political crisis as ETA tried to separate this part of Spain away from the central government. So there it is in the distance. You can see how the city exists in this long valley. And it has now today this wonderful installation by Richard Serra, which is especially appropriate given the role of steel in the city historically. This is a gift from Mittal Asalor, the great steel company that worked with Richard Serra and is really, to my mind, one of the most important manifestations of contemporary sculpture anywhere in the world. At the same moment, Tom Krenz made an arrangement with Deutsche Bank. Here we are at Unter der Linden in the former eastern part of Berlin. This is the 19th century headquarters for the bank. He convinced the bank that to enter a 15-year agreement where a 5,000 square foot space, which had previously been where the tellers were, facing the street, could be an exhibition space, and the bank would commission artists that the museum chose. We would take half of the objects for the collection of the Guggenheim, and the bank would take the other half. So it's a very advanced way of building a collection and offering artists a very concise place. You're looking at photos by Sugimoto. There are also shows that featured paintings by Jeff Koons. Half of these paintings came to the Guggenheim, the other half to the bank. Then my predecessor also made a number of overtures to other cities, including in China, in Rio, Salzburg, places that did not come to fruition. But he made in 2005 a fruitful contact with the United Arab Emirates, and because, at least in America, people are not clear where this is, I'm showing it to you on the map. You see it's between Oman and Saudi Arabia, and when they talk about problems in the Straits of Hormuz, this is the very narrow water between Iran and United Arab Emirates. By good luck, United Arab Emirates has 11% of the world's oil, so they're very happy and tremendously wealthy. It's a new country that stopped being an English protectorate only in the late 1960s and has gradually assumed a new role in the world. Everyone's heard of Dubai, the big one of the 6 cities that makes this federation a great trading city. Abu Dhabi, in fact, is the government center for this conglomeration of Arab tribes. I'm showing this overview so you recognize that Abu Dhabi city, which is to the left, is relatively compact, not unlike Turin, but it doesn't look like Turin, but has a small grid and is inhabited by about 300,000 people in this way. And the island called Saadiyat Island, which is above the city, is a 20-mile-long expanse of sand, which is meant eventually to be where the growth of the city will happen, with cultural facilities and housing in this triangle of red. It will be built over the next 15 years. Also, this map, interestingly, incorporates the site of Masdar, which is their experiment with a carbon-neutral urban neighborhood designed by Norman Foster. In Saadiyat, there will eventually be Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, a National History Museum that's co-sponsored by the British Museum, a museum for maritime, and also a performing arts hall, all in this village of creativity. So Frank Gehry, beginning in 2005, studied what the possibilities were. This is an early version of the building, which I can tell you is quite large, 540,000 square feet, which is approximately 54,000 square meters. It's also 21 stories high. And today, this is the agreed upon plan for this exceptional museum, which is located on reclaimed land out into the Persian Gulf. Its mission is to present art from around the world after 1965. So the Louvre takes care of prehistory until 1965, with a beautiful building designed by Jean Nouvel. And then we have this other ambition, which is to survey contemporary art of the last 40 years into the future in this exceptional building. So you see it from the side. There'll be a very large and very needed library and archive. The library would, of course, be global. The archive is essentially about Middle East modernism. This collection, even though it begins after the period of pop art, also looks back at the achievements of modernism in the Middle East and the Mediterranean from 1915 until 1965. So there are examples of Egyptian, Syrian, Lebanese art that we think relate to the more contemporary pieces in the collection as well. And that's the final view, looking from the city to Abu Dhabi. So my idea was to say to you that the Guggenheim, as you know, began with a family. Now it's a kind of family of museums. We may be pregnant. We're talking to the city of Helsinki, and we think that in a few weeks we'll make an announcement that there might be Guggenheim in Helsinki, which will be an opportunity for us to become in closer dialogue with our friends from Russia in particular, but also the whole Baltic region, which today might be underserved by contemporary art and artists. And after that, I'm not sure what happens, but when we build Abu Dhabi and we build Helsinki, I think we'll have a very happy constellation of components inside this notion of the Guggenheim. Let me end by saying to you, and this is something that we can probably talk more about with Francesco here. For me, it wasn't natural to think of museums in so many locations with a different set of responsibilities, because to be honest, working in a museum, typically you can be quite a conservative person. Your general attitude is, how do I save this? And how do I keep people away from this? And only let them understand it through my eyes. That's a very cynical way of looking at it, but frequently that's the motivation inside someone working in a museum. So I'm presented with a different idea here, which is, how can the museum and the people inside the museum and the art community and people who look at art enter into the dialogue of what it means to be civilized and politically active in the 21st century. So for me, it's a very different kind of challenge, one that really only is successful when we're able to talk to people as peers, and then we see many, many people arguing about color instead of guns and borders and old problems. So it's an exciting way for the museum to assume a new set of responsibilities. I have to be modest and tell you I don't understand the world yet, and maybe no one does. But it's very interesting to see that there is a community of people who think about these kinds of things everywhere that one goes. Thank you.
When I was writing for Flashshot, I wrote a very bad review of Richard Carnegie International.
Which I've never forgotten.
I know, I never forgot. I'm still waiting for the revenge, which will come eventually. I don't know when, but I know that's. I know that there is another thing, but you know that's what happened. And obviously, you also understand something that if you want to build a museum, you take two places and you ask Richard which one would be better, and whatever you choose the other one. I don't know which was the other compared with Helsinki, probably, you know. I hope Helsinki was not his choice, if we look back into this Pittsburgh war thing. But it's very interesting. And what the museum today, you talk about the role of the museum in the world, and how you, and you talked at the beginning about the museum with the neon sign, that was kind of a way of advertising, and today would be unthinkable, would be actually impure to put the neon sign outside if it's not made by an artist. And yet the museum becomes a spectacle. The Maurizio Catalan show proved that spectacle is a big part of running a museum.
But in my defense, and the defense of the museum, the artist chose the composition of what he did. So if it's a spectacle, it's because he did that, not us. And so for me, that's the argument. Because if I took this and made it into something spectacular, then that's my problem, or my doing. But because Maurizio did what he wanted, we thought it was very defensible.
Yeah, no, it was not an accusation. It was the way to say you know, spectacle is a big part of making exhibition. I mean, people is expecting something that they are both entertained and informed. But you know, entertainment is a big part of exhibition making.
I think I would say it differently. When I first went to Bilbao, when it opened, I thought to myself as a curator, the spaces are too big and they're hostile to art. I didn't perceive the space correctly, or I wasn't smart enough to see what it was. Now when I go there 10 years later or 15 years later, I see that Frank Gehry was looking at the space of the future. And in the world that we're living in, even though we have, you know, simple names for it, like transnational or whatever you want to use, in fact, we're facing, our children are facing a very different spatial relationship than we know. And now, next week I go to Asia, where you see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of 65-story buildings, and people, 25 million people living in one conglomeration. And we have to recognize that the space that we knew from Europe and America it's changing radically. And so for me, the spectacle is not always the content, but frequently it's the container. I think we're in a moment of transition towards recognizing that not only is bigger better sometimes, but bigger is obligatory sometimes.
And do you think they change also our relationship with art?
No question, we know together young artists who feel obliged to make something much, much bigger because the container is expecting that, and so does the audience. And this is not always leading to better art, it's just leading to bigger art, and sometimes making the artist quite unhappy also.
Yeah, because also the one thing of the Guggenheim as an institution, all the building that it shows, they kind of confirm that, is that they are all buildings that they kind, I don't say they compete, but they challenge the artist. No other museum in the world really challenged the artist, particularly in New York. The artist, you know, and I think, you know, Maurizio, with this exhibition, created a lot of problems for the people that will come after him, because how you can match.
Well, I think we have to be honest that Frank Lloyd Wright hated artists. And every drawing that you see for the museum from his hand, it's really his drawing on the wall, not anyone else's. And until a very late moment, he was asking the museum not to have electric lights, only to have natural light. And really what he was interested in was sculpture by Frank Lloyd Wright that you would walk through, in my opinion. But in his whole life, he really had no connection to any other living painter, and there are some very good ones at that moment. and no real connection to any real collectors at that time. And even if you go to the houses that he makes, like Falling Water, what he's interested in is showing is Japanese prints that he sells to people, or nothing. Yeah. So he, in a way, he's an architect who has no taste for art. Frank Gehry, on the other hand, is very close friends with artists. And in the end, I think he's much more empathetic to art.
Don't you think he's competing with the artists? Don't you think there's the problem that a lot of artists today are kind of competing with the artists, with their object, and the opposite problem, there are a lot of artists that are competing with architects without making names.
Well, I think we had a happy moment called the Baroque previously when this was going on, so it's not always terrible, but it has to be a good artist talking to a good architect.
And sometimes architects don't understand art, as you say. A lot of them that are building today.
Especially today.
Today, yeah. Why so?
I'm not sure, but in America at least, being an architect is a very difficult, it's a very difficult gestation. It's like being a sculptor. You can be a very good painter when you're 27, and you can already begin making a life as a painter. When you're a sculptor or an architect, sometimes this doesn't happen until you're 51 or 52, or it comes much later in life. And because already at that point you're very formed, I think most of the architects and some sculptors as well have much less possibility for growth.
And listen, you said before, you know, the original project of Frank Lloyd Wright with the building where now you have your office, it was supposed to be a housing for artists. And you say, thanks God. We love artists, but you know, why do you think that an artist living near a museum can be a problem?
Near is beautiful, but not inside.
Well, that's
I think one thing that we have
I hope they had a different entrance, the two buildings.
They would have, yeah. But I think one thing that sometimes is forgotten is that the first audience for contemporary museums should be living artists. They're the people who have the most at stake, and that's the audience that needs to be served the most. And then come the regular public. But for us, when we're thinking about what should the museum do, frequently we're thinking about what do artists need to see.
Yeah, we do it. We play for our own crowd often, no? But there is this paradox that the more the museum become popular, the more people that know not too much about art visit them, and now you can connect how do you jump from art for artists and museum for architects?
I think the museum's job is to be legible. Even I go there, I shouldn't have to know anything. All I have to be is inquisitive. But does the museum tell me what I'm looking at in a way that I can understand? Or if I choose not to read anything, do I remember what I look at? That's the job of the museum. Can I walk away remembering what I saw? And frequently when that happens, it has an effect on me, just like when I hear a song. I can't get the song out of my head. I'm thinking of this art object for some reason, I don't even know what it is. But because I remember it, it's powerful.
How do you think they are?
And let me add something. There I think the Guggenheim has a very big advantage in New York in particular, because when you go there, you remember what you see. And that's a very important thing. I go to many museums, but I'm not always remembering what I saw.
But tell me something, you know, there is, in Italy we have this particular problem, but there is a certain hostility toward contemporary art.
Hostility.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, but this hostility put, particularly in countries that are sustained by public money, put the public administrator in a position to avoid to give money to contemporary art because they don't like hostility.
That's bad. But
how do you solve this? If hostility is good, how do you solve the problem?
I think you admit that there's hostility and you say from the government side, our duty is to be on the side of creative people. And then if I'm the taxpayer, I make a lot of noise and we hope to come together.
That's very optimistic.
Well, we have the worst problem in America, which is no investment from the public money in culture. So instead, we don't have, there's no true participation from the average person towards the museum. That's not healthy either.
Yeah, but we have a lot of private people that give a lot of money, so that we don't have. We would love to exchange. And give you our politician and give you our
Really, the solution has to be that the two approaches come together as much as possible. And the important thing is when the taxpayer rises up and says to the leadership, this is important, and I think that we should invest in it. We have this scandal in America. We pay for the football stadiums with public money, but that's not correct. You know, they're being used 12 or 13 times a year at a very high expense, and still when I go there I have to give $500 to see the football game, and the same people are not making investments in culture. I think it's wrong.
Yeah. Listen, tell now we finish the conversation. Maybe someone has some question, but tell to the Italian public. You know, some people have this misunderstanding. We saw in the interview, but that Guggenheim goes around looking for places and begging people to build the Guggenheim Museum. While you told me that a lot of people.
Yeah, every week a delegation comes to New York, and there are always people that you can become friendly with. But they don't have the right ingredients to make the idea happen. The ingredients are very strong political leadership that doesn't care about hostility. Private capital, of course. And then for us, it's important that it be in a city that's not being, today, it's not being properly served by the local power. It's not an idea for us to go to London or Paris or Berlin, where there's already many opportunities. It's to go to a city where there are very, very few opportunities. So that's what we're thinking of all the time. So these delegations come to me. The last one was from Mongolia. And Ulaanbaatar sounds like a beautiful city. I'm not going to go there yet.
They have a beautiful building.
I don't know. I'm just meeting the president of Mongolia twice now, and I'm realizing he's an interesting person. And he has an idea about civilization in Mongolia. So our idea is now to take the painting conservators and send them to Mongolia and help their conservators become more advanced. But it is true, it's not possible, but when I go to these other cities, I see the same person, and I realize this person is a leader in that city and a very good and fine person. I feel like I have a new friend, but I can't offer them a museum.
But the one thing is clear, that the Guggenheim doesn't come for free.
No.
Exactly.
But neither does your doctor.
No, yeah, exactly. But no, that's to be clear. Some people think that the Guggenheim come for free.
No, it's not free. It's supposed to be mutually.
It's like health insurance. It doesn't come for free.
It's supposed to be mutually beneficial, like health insurance.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Thank you very much. If you have any,
we have questions now.
If you have any questions, please.
When we first met, it was at a friend's party and in Connecticut, and it was actually a party for you being made the head of the Guggenheim. What were your ambitions then, and looking back, what do you think you have accomplished?
Well, I was very naive because I wasn't thinking I was getting another job. I left my previous job thinking now I can relax. And then 1 month later I have a new job. And honestly, when I lived in New York twice before, I was working for the Whitney Museum. This is the enemy of the Guggenheim Museum. So I had a very different attitude towards the Guggenheim Museum. And it was difficult for me to understand the trustees, which were not like the trustees I knew before, and the so-called empire of the museum I didn't understand well. I had a special fond spot for Venice because it's so unusual, and who doesn't love the Peggy Guggenheim collection? But the other places I knew, but I had no real understanding of how they connected with New York. So really the big change, I think, is clarifying for me, and I hope also for the people inside the museum, that it's not a colonial model. That it's meant to be a model where peers talk to each other, and that they form a community of people who are inquisitive, respect each other, and care deeply about modern and contemporary art, and they have that conversation. But that's a big task, and I must say that 50% of my time I'm in airplanes, because that's inherent in this opportunity and the challenge as well. So when I met you in Connecticut, I was very simple and very happy. It was my birthday. The cake was great. And then 3 years later, But I think it's interesting for us to think about where we live in a developed, stable situation. We can begin this dialogue with interested parties in China, in everywhere. Eventually, I hope Africa, certainly Latin America. Can all these people come together in an informal way and exchange ideas and have respect for each other? Ultimately, I think our job as ambassadors of peace, even though we have peace with hostility, is that we have to respect the other person. We have to recognize the other person. And the art is such an easy, beautiful way to do that. There was one.
Okay, as Patricia said, this is very international, so I think my question could be rather international than domestic. Okay, as you say, the Guggenheim, they had Guggenheim in New York and Guggenheim Bilbao, and also they go to in Abu Dhabi and another place. And eventually I was heard actually from a few years ago, Guggenheim planning their museum in China as well. But so far didn't get cushion. But I overheard there are going to be another museum built by Frank Gehry and the very well-known Chinese artist Cai Guoqiang in Quanzhou, which will be really not be in reality in 2013. And how do you think, if you think Bilbao, when you go there to have a look, you make a mistake for saying this is not as successful as it's the architect, and how do you say this museum is going to be in China, in the certain kind of, which is actually kind of faraway place?
Well, China has a big advantage because the audience is so big. I think Frank Gehry is very empathetic to that artist. He was on my plane last night, so we were talking, Frank Gehry. The building won't look at all like Bilbao. And I think it's an interesting way for China to begin asserting contemporary art, the role of contemporary art in the society. So for me, it's very positive. Will it be successful? Time will tell. I thought the Warhol Museum would be endlessly successful, and in some ways it is, but it's not attracting the people that we expected it would. So it's not a guarantee that many people come, but I think it's a worthy project. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Good. There won't be a Guggenheim in China, by the way. That's not happening.
I've heard about that.
Yeah, there was the idea to make a museum in Taiwan, and that didn't work. And then when I go to China today, I realize they don't need a Guggenheim. What we need is a very deep connection to the museums that exist in China today so that we can be friendly with them in a different way. Yeah.
It's a Guggenheim in Taiwan, not Taiwan.
No more? Thank you for coming, and I'm here.